Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight, we are going to talk about Napoleon, a man who dreamed of empires and whose shadow still lingers over the map of history. There is an island in the Mediterranean, a place where mountains meet the sea, where the air carries salt and the scent of wild herbs. This island is called Corsica, and it was here, on the 15th of August in 1769, that a boy was born into a world that did not yet know his name. The house stood in Ajaccio, a town of narrow streets and stone buildings that seemed to grow from the very rock of the island itself. Inside, in a room where shutters filtered the bright summer light into soft golden bars, Letizia Bonaparte brought her second son into the world. They called him Napoleone, a name that rolled off the tongue like the waves that crashed against Corsica's shores. Corsica was not a quiet place in those years, though its beauty suggested peace. The island had only recently become French, torn from the hands of Genoa and the dreams of Corsican independence. The mountains still whispered of resistance, of a man named Pasquale Paoli who had fought for freedom. Young Carlo Bonaparte, Napoleon's father, had stood with Paoli in those final days, before pragmatism and survival led him to accept French rule, to seek advancement within the new order. The boy grew in this landscape of contradiction, where loyalty shifted like the winds that bent the maquis shrubs, where the past and future seemed to wrestle in the stones beneath his feet. He was not the eldest, Joseph held that place, but there was something in Napoleon, even then, that marked him as different. His eyes, dark and searching, seemed to look beyond the island shores, beyond the horizon where sea met sky. He learned the stories of Corsica from his mother, a woman of iron will and quiet strength who managed the household while Carlo sought favor in the courts of France. Letizia told her children of their heritage, of the island's fierce independence, of honor and family. These lessons sank deep into Napoleon's spirit, roots that would anchor him even as he drifted far from this rocky shore. The island shaped him in ways both subtle and profound. The rugged terrain taught him resilience, the complexity of Corsican politics, the way power shifted and reformed, gave him his first lessons in human nature and ambition. And the sea, always the sea, whispered of distant lands, of possibilities that stretched beyond the visible world. In the streets of Ajaccio, the boy played with his siblings, but often he withdrew, seeking solitude in the hills or among the olive groves. There, beneath trees that had stood for centuries, he would sit and think, his mind already beginning to map territories far beyond Corsica's shores. He was small for his age, thin and often unwell, but his will was like the island rock, unyielding and ancient. The Bonaparte family was noble, but their nobility was of the lesser sort, enough to claim honor, but not wealth. Carlo worked tirelessly to secure advantages for his children, knowing that their future lay not in Corsica's mountains, but in the great machine of France. He wrote letters, made journeys, cultivated connections. For young Napoleon, this meant opportunity, a chance to leave the island and enter a world of academies and appointments. At 9 years old, Napoleon left Corsica. The journey across the water was not merely geographical, but existential. Behind him lay the only world he had known, the smells of thyme and rosemary, the particular light that turned the sea to liquid gold at sunset, his mother's voice in the evening. Ahead lay France, a country vast and strange, where he would be judged by his accent and his origins, where he would have to prove himself worthy of the opportunities his father's maneuvering had secured. But that departure comes later in our story. For now, let us linger a moment more in Corsica, in the childhood of a boy who did not yet know he would reshape the world. Let us see him standing on a hillside, looking out across the Mediterranean, the wind in his dark hair, his mind already beginning to dream of empires that existed only in his imagination, empires that would one day cast their shadow across all of Europe. The island would remain with him always, a memory of stone and sea, a reminder of beginnings. Even when he ruled from palaces and commanded armies, some part of Napoleon would always belong to Corsica, to that moment when the world was small and all of history lay waiting, patient and unknowing, for the boy to step forward and claim his destiny. The crossing from Corsica to mainland France was a journey between worlds. Napoleon watched the island grow smaller behind the ship, its mountains fading into mist until there was only water and sky. He was 9 years old, traveling with his older brother Joseph to the College of Autumn, where French would replace Italian in their mouths, where the rough edges of island life would be smoothed away, polished into something acceptable to continental eyes. At Autumn, the first lessons were linguistic. Napoleon's French was halting, colored by Italian vowels and Corsican cadences. The other boys heard it immediately, this mark of otherness, and children being children, they did not let it pass unremarked. But Napoleon was already learning to turn weakness into strength, to use mockery as fuel for the fire of his ambition. He studied with fierce concentration, determined to master this language that would become the instrument of his rise. The months at Autumn were brief, a prelude to something greater. Napoleon showed promise, a quickness of mind that caught the attention of his instructors. And so, within a year, another journey began. This time to Brienne-le-Château, to the Royal Military Academy, where sons of lesser nobility learned the arts of war and command. Brienne stood in the Champagne region, surrounded by the gentle hills and ordered fields of northern France. The academy itself was austere, a former monastery converted to the business of making officers for the king's army. Stone walls enclosed courtyards where boys drilled and studied, where the rhythm of military discipline replaced the anarchic freedom of childhood. Napoleon arrived in May of 1779, small for his age, speaking French with an accent that still betrayed his origins. The other cadets came from families of greater standing. Their French was native and effortless, their comfort in this world complete. Napoleon stood apart, not entirely by choice. He was different, and difference in such places invites both curiosity and cruelty. The other boys called him the Little Corsican, sometimes with affection, more often with disdain. France and Corsica had been enemies not long ago, and memory is slow to forgive old wars. Napoleon bore these slights with outward calm, but inside, pride burned like a coal that would not be extinguished. He retreated into study, into the world of books and military theory, where merit mattered more than birth or accent. In the library at Brienne, among volumes of history and military strategy, Napoleon found his true teachers. He read of Alexander and Caesar, of Hannibal crossing the Alps, of empires rising and falling like tides. He absorbed the lessons of geography, understanding how terrain shaped battle, how supply lines determined victory, how the map itself was a kind of battlefield where campaigns were won or lost before a single soldier marched. Mathematics came easily to him, the clean logic of numbers and trajectories. Artillery particularly caught his imagination, the way calculation and force combined to break fortifications, to change the course of battles. While other boys socialized in the courtyards, Napoleon worked through problems of angle and distance, of powder charges and projectile arc. He was building, even then, the foundation of his military genius. The seasons turned at Brienne, 5 years marked by the rhythm of military academy life. Spring brought drill in the courtyards. Summer heat made the stone buildings oppressive. Autumn colored the surrounding hills in shades of rust and gold. And winter locked the world in frost and early darkness. Through it all, Napoleon studied, observed, absorbed. He made few friends, but those he made were loyal. Louis-Antoine Fauvelin de Bourrienne became his companion in those years, drawn perhaps by Napoleon's intensity, by the sense that this strange Corsican boy was marked for something beyond the ordinary. They walked together in the gardens, discussing strategy and philosophy, planning futures that seemed impossibly distant. In the winter of his 3rd year at Brienne, Napoleon received news from Corsica. His father was ill, the disease advancing despite doctors' efforts. The news came in a letter, ink on paper, traveling across hundreds of miles to reach the boy in his northern exile. Carlo Bonaparte was dying, and there was nothing Napoleon could do but carry the knowledge with him through his daily routines, this first lesson in the powerlessness that comes with distance. Carlo died the following year. Napoleon was 14, too far from home to attend the funeral, too engaged in his studies to return to an island that was beginning to feel like a memory rather than a home. His father's death meant more than personal loss. It meant the family's fortunes now rested on fragile foundations, that Napoleon's own advancement became not merely ambition, but necessity. The boy responded as he always did, by working harder, by proving his worth through achievement. In the summer of 1784, an inspector came to Brienne to examine the cadets and recommend the most promising for advancement to the École Militaire in Paris. Napoleon, now 15, demonstrated his knowledge of mathematics and military theory. The inspector noted the young Corsican's abilities, his quickness of mind, his particular aptitude for artillery. The recommendation was made. Napoleon Bonaparte would continue his education in Paris at the most prestigious military academy in France, where the future officers of the King's army received their final polish before entering service. Another journey awaited, another step away from Corsica and toward a destiny that was slowly beginning to take shape, like a figure emerging from morning mist. Paris, when Napoleon arrived in October of 1784, was a city beyond anything Corsica or Brienne had prepared him for. The noise, the crowds, the sheer density of human ambition and activity overwhelmed the senses. The École Militaire stood in the Champ de Mars, a grand building that spoke of France's power and pretension. Here, the future commanders of armies learned not just military science, but the social graces expected of officers and gentlemen. Napoleon remained an outsider, still marked by his accent, still bearing the pride and resentment of his island origins. But he was closer now to his goal, to the career that would provide not just for himself, but for his family. The work at the École Militaire was more advanced than at Brienne, the competition fiercer. Napoleon thrived on it, his mind sharpening against the whetstone of challenge. In his room at the academy, by the light of candles that turned the walls to gold and shadow, Napoleon continued his private education. He read history and philosophy, studying Rousseau and Voltaire, absorbing ideas about society and government that would later inform his reshaping of France. He practiced his French until the Corsican accent faded to a faint music beneath his words, though he could never entirely erase it, nor perhaps did he want to. The months passed. Napoleon completed what usually took 2 years in a single year. Such was his focus and ability. In September of 1785, he took the final examinations for his artillery commission. The examiners noted his exceptional understanding of mathematics and artillery science, his strategic thinking, his unusual maturity for 16 years of age. He graduated 42nd in a class of 58, a ranking that seems unremarkable until one considers the obstacles he overcame, the social and linguistic barriers that might have defeated a less determined spirit. He was now Second Lieutenant Napoleon Bonaparte, an artillery officer in the King's army, drawing a modest salary that would help support his family back in Corsica. But France itself was changing, like a house where the foundations have begun to shift, where cracks appear in walls that seemed eternal. The king's finances were in disorder, the common people restless beneath the weight of taxes and privilege. New ideas circulated in salons and coffee-houses, questions about rights and representation, about the nature of power and who should wield it. Napoleon, assigned to garrison duty in Valence, watched these currents with the same analytical gaze he brought to military problems. His years in France had transformed the island boy into something else, a man between worlds. Too French for Corsica now, yet still too Corsican for easy acceptance in France. But perhaps this very liminality was his strength, allowing him to see what others missed, to understand that the old order was dying and something new was struggling to be born. In the evenings, in whatever garrison town his duties took him, Napoleon continued to read and write. He composed essays on Corsican history, on military strategy, on the nature of governance. Most would never be published, but they were his way of thinking through the world, of preparing himself for opportunities he could not yet name, but somehow sensed were coming. The dream was taking shape, though Napoleon himself might not have recognized it yet. It was not simply a dream of advancement or even of glory. It was something deeper, a vision of himself as an instrument of history, a belief that he was meant for more than the slow progression of peacetime military service. The boy who had left Corsica had become a man waiting, with a patience born of necessity and an impatience born of genius, for history to provide the stage where he could finally step forward and become himself. The year 1789 arrived like a wind that builds slowly on the horizon, barely noticed at first, then suddenly everywhere, bending trees and scattering leaves, changing everything it touches. In Paris, the Estates General convened for the first time in over a century, summoned by a king who needed money and inadvertently provided a forum for voices that would not be silenced. Napoleon, 20 years old, was far from Paris that spring, on leave in Corsica, watching his island's politics with the same intensity he brought to everything. But even on that distant shore, the tremors from the mainland could be felt. France was transforming, and the change would not stop at any border, would not respect any distance. In June, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly. In July, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille, that ancient fortress that symbolized royal authority. The stones of the old prison came down like a wall between past and future, and across France the news spread like fire in dry grass. The king had lost control, not to another king or to an invading army, but to his own people, to an idea that power might rest somewhere other than in a crown and throne. Napoleon returned to his regiment in France that autumn, to a country that barely resembled the one he had left. The army itself was fracturing along the fault lines of loyalty and belief. Some officers, particularly those of ancient noble lineage, were already fleeing to foreign courts, joining the émigrés who gathered beyond France's borders, plotting restoration. Others embraced the revolution, seeing in it a promise of merit over birth, of opportunity over privilege. Napoleon navigated these currents with care. He was not naturally a revolutionary. His instincts were for order, for structure, for the efficient functioning of power. But he recognized opportunity when it appeared, and the revolution was creating vacancies in the officer corps, openings that would have been impossible under the old regime. A Corsican of minor nobility might rise now in ways that would have been unthinkable before. In Corsica, during another leave in 1791, Napoleon became involved in the island's revolutionary politics, aligning himself with forces that supported the new French order. He joined the Jacobin Club, participated in local military actions, maneuvered within the complex web of Corsican factions. But the island's politics were treacherous, old grudges ran deep, and Napoleon's family found themselves on the wrong side of the dominant faction. By 1793, the Bonaparte family fled Corsica, driven out by supporters of Paoli, the same man Carlo Bonaparte had once followed. Napoleon's childhood home was ransacked, his family's property confiscated. The island that had been his origin became a place of exile. A door closed behind him. He would never return to live in Corsica again. France, the country that had once seemed foreign, became his only home by necessity, and then by choice. But France in 1793 was a country at war, both with itself and with the gathered powers of Europe. The king had been executed in January, his head falling to the guillotine blade, ending 1,000 years of monarchy in a moment of revolutionary justice or revolutionary excess, depending on who told the story. The revolutionary government faced enemies on every border: Austria and Prussia, Britain and Spain, all determined to crush this dangerous experiment in republican government. Inside France, civil war raged in the Vendée, royalists rising against the revolution. In the south, cities like Lyon and Toulon rejected the radical government in Paris, declaring for the monarchy, opening their gates to foreign troops. It was chaos, the kind of disorder that destroys ordinary men, but makes opportunities for extraordinary ones. Napoleon, now a captain of artillery, was assigned to the army besieging Toulon, a vital port on the Mediterranean that had admitted British and Spanish forces. The siege had been dragging on for months, the revolutionary forces unable to dislodge the well-defended garrison. Artillery was positioned poorly, strategy was confused, leadership was divided. Napoleon, observing with his trained eye, saw what needed to be done. He wrote a plan, a proposal for placing artillery on the heights commanding the harbour, making the anchorage untenable for enemy ships. If the fleet withdrew, the garrison would be isolated, and the city would fall. It was clear, logical, the kind of geometric solution that appealed to Napoleon's mathematical mind. The plan reached the representative of the government with the army, a man named Salicetti, who happened to be a fellow Corsican and who recognized ability when he saw it. Napoleon was given command of the artillery. He was 24 years old, and this was his first real test, his first chance to demonstrate the genius that had been developing in quiet study and patient observation. He threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity, positioning guns, organizing supply, driving men who were exhausted and demoralized with his own inexhaustible energy. The weather turned cold as autumn became winter, rain turned the ground to mud, but Napoleon seemed not to notice discomfort. He was everywhere, checking positions, calculating angles, encouraging gunners. A horse was killed under him during one bombardment. He barely paused before finding another. A minor wound to his thigh. He had it dressed and continued working. In December, the assault came. Napoleon's artillery had done its work, making the harbour too dangerous for the Allied fleet. The ships withdrew, and with them went the garrison's hope of resupply or reinforcement. The revolutionary forces stormed the defences, and Toulon fell. The recapture was complete, and the retribution that followed was terrible. The kind of revolutionary justice that left streets running red and families destroyed. Napoleon's role in the victory was recognized. He was promoted to brigadier general, an extraordinary advancement for a 24-year-old captain. His name, previously known only to his immediate circle, now circulated in the reports that flowed to Paris to the Committee of Public Safety, to men like Robespierre who held France's fate in their hands. But favour in revolutionary France was as dangerous as obscurity. The political winds shifted constantly. Yesterday's hero could be tomorrow's traitor, and the guillotine waited for those who found themselves on the wrong side of faction. Napoleon's association with Augustin Robespierre, younger brother of Maximilien, seemed advantageous when the Robespierres held power. But in July 1794, Thermidor arrived. The Robespierre fell, and those connected to them fell with them, or scrambled to prove their distance from the disgraced regime. Napoleon was arrested, briefly imprisoned, questioned about his loyalties. The same revolution that had elevated him now threatened to consume him, as it had consumed so many others. But he survived, released for lack of evidence of any real conspiracy. His career, however, seemed stalled. Without patronage, with the taint of associations with fallen leaders, advancement appeared unlikely. He spent months in a kind of limbo, assigned to minor posts, his strategic mind wasted on administrative duties. He considered leaving military service altogether, perhaps seeking opportunity in the Ottoman Empire, where French officers were sometimes employed to modernize armies. The future seemed unclear, the path forward blocked by the same political chaos that had once opened doors. France itself was exhausted from revolution. The terror had ended, but the country was still at war, still struggling to establish stable government, still divided between those who wanted to push the revolution further and those who longed for order. The Directory, a 5-man executive, took power in 1795, attempting to chart a moderate course between extremes. In Paris that October, royalist factions attempted an uprising, hoping to exploit the government's weakness. The Directory needed someone to defend the Tuileries Palace, someone who could use artillery to control the streets, someone who had proven themselves capable in crisis. They turned to Napoleon. He accepted the assignment without hesitation. This was the kind of problem he understood, a military solution to a political threat. He sent for artillery, including cannons from the military school at Sablons, and positioned them to command the approaches to the palace. When the royalist forces advanced, Napoleon gave the order to fire. Grapeshot, that terrible anti-personnel ammunition, tore into the crowds. The uprising dissolved in blood and panic. It was over in hours. The Directory was saved, and Napoleon was again a man of the moment, celebrated for his decisiveness, for his willingness to use force when the situation demanded it. Some called it the whiff of grapeshot, a phrase that would cling to the memory of that day, a reminder that Napoleon's rise was built not just on brilliance, but on a willingness to make hard choices, to bear the weight of necessary violence. His reward was command of the army of Italy, a force that existed more on paper than in reality, under-strength, under-supplied, facing Austrian forces in the mountains and valleys of northern Italy. Most officers would have seen it as a punishment, a command designed to fail. Napoleon saw opportunity, a chance to demonstrate what he could do when given an army and a mission. Before leaving for Italy, he married Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow 6 years his senior, a woman of grace and connections who brought him entry to circles that his Corsican origins and military career had not provided. It was a marriage of attraction and advantage, passion mixed with pragmatism, a pattern that would characterize much of Napoleon's life. The revolution had been Napoleon's education in the exercise of power. It had shown him how quickly the world could change, how opportunity emerged from chaos, how merit could overcome birth if one was bold enough to seize the moment. The boy from Corsica had become a general of France, a man with an army and a mission, standing on the edge of achievements that would make the revolution itself seem like merely the prelude to something greater. The army of Italy, when Napoleon took command in March 1796, was a ragged collection of hungry men and broken promises. They had not been paid in months, their uniforms were threadbare, supplies were scarce, and morale existed only in the most theoretical sense. The Directory in Paris expected little from this force. It was meant merely to fix Austrian attention while the main French armies operated in Germany. Napoleon arrived at his headquarters in Nice, 26 years old, slight of build, younger than most of his officers, bearing a surname that still sounded foreign to French ears. The generals under his command looked at him with skepticism, some with barely concealed contempt. But when he began to speak, explaining his plan for the campaign, something changed in the room. His certainty was absolute, his vision clear, and his belief in victory so complete that it became, almost against will, infectious. The plan was aggressive, an attack that would split the Austrian and Piedmontese armies before they could combine, then defeat them in detail. Speed would replace strength, maneuver would overcome numbers, and the army of Italy, for so long neglected and defensive, would carry the war into enemy territory. The generals listened, and slowly their doubt began to transform into something else, a recognition that this strange young commander might actually know what he was doing. Napoleon addressed the army, his words mixing inspirations with promise. He spoke of glory and of plunder, of liberating Italy and enriching themselves, of making their names immortal through deeds that would echo through history. But beyond the rhetoric, there was a plan, meticulous and mathematical, that turned strategic vision into marching orders, into positions and movements that exploited every geographic advantage. The campaign began in April. The French army moved fast, covering distances that surprised their enemies, appearing where they were not expected, striking before the opposition could concentrate. At Montenotte, at Millesimo, at Dego, the French won small victories that accumulated into strategic advantage. The Austrian and Piedmontese commanders, used to more leisurely warfare, found themselves constantly reacting, always a step behind the rapid movements of Napoleon's forces. By the end of April, Piedmont had sued for peace. The Kingdom of Sardinia withdrew from the war, giving France control of the Alpine passes and removing a threat from Napoleon's flank. The campaign that was supposed to be a diversion was becoming the main event, and Paris was beginning to pay attention to the unexpected successes of their youngest general. Napoleon turned his attention to the Austrians, who were reinforcing their positions in northern Italy. The strategic prize was the crossing of the Po River, the barrier that protected Austrian-controlled Lombardy. Napoleon feinted toward one crossing, then moved rapidly to another, getting his army across the river before the Austrians could respond. At the village of Lodi in May, French forces fought their way across a bridge under heavy fire, a small action that became legendary in revolutionary lore, a symbol of revolutionary courage and elan. Milan fell soon after, and Napoleon entered the city as a liberator and conqueror both. The Milanese welcomed the French, seeing them as bringers of revolutionary ideals and freedom from Austrian rule, though Napoleon's exactions of money and art would soon temper that enthusiasm. The army of Italy, so recently starving, was now enriched with the spoils of Lombardy, and Napoleon ensured that some of that wealth flowed back to Paris, to the directory that was his ultimate authority. But Napoleon was already operating with a degree of independence that made him more than simply a general following orders. He negotiated treaties, imposed terms on defeated states, reorganized conquered territories, all with minimal consultation with Paris. The Directory, pleased with his success and the money he was sending, allowed him this latitude. They did not yet realize they were creating something beyond their control, a general who was becoming a political force in his own right. The summer of 1796 brought more victories. At Castiglione, Napoleon defeated an Austrian attempt to relieve the besieged fortress of Mantua. At Arcole in November, there was a battle that became legend, Napoleon himself supposedly seizing a flag and leading a charge across a bridge, inspiring his men to break through. Whether the story was true in all its details mattered less than its effect. It became part of the growing mythology around the young general. Mantua fell in February 1797 after a long siege. The Austrian hold on Italy was broken, and Napoleon advanced toward Vienna itself, into the Alpine passes, closer to the heart of the Austrian Empire than any French force had reached. The Austrians facing threats from other French armies, and now this unstoppable advance through Italy, sued for peace. Napoleon negotiated the Treaty of Campo Formio in October 1797, largely on his own authority, presenting the Directory with a fait accompli. Austria ceded the Austrian Netherlands and recognized French control of territories west of the Rhine. France gained the Ionian Islands and much of northern Italy. The Republic of Venice, ancient and proud, was partitioned between France and Austria, its independence extinguished by the same revolutionary forces that claimed to spread liberty. The campaign in Italy made Napoleon's reputation. He had taken a broken army and turned it into an instrument of conquest. He had shown himself not just a talented tactician, but a strategist who understood the broader political dimensions of warfare. He had demonstrated an ability to inspire men, to push them beyond what they thought possible, to make them believe in victory even when circumstances suggested defeat. More than that, he had shown a ruthlessness in pursuit of objectives, a willingness to ignore inconvenient rules or orders when they interfered with his vision. The Directory in Paris celebrated him as the Republic's greatest general, but some among them must have felt a twinge of unease, wondering if they had created a force they could no longer fully control. Napoleon returned to France in December 1797, celebrated as a conquering hero, feted by the Directory, cheered by crowds. He was 28 years old and had achieved more than most generals achieve in a lifetime. But rather than rest on these laurels, he was already thinking ahead, considering what came next. What new theatre of operations might provide the opportunity for further glory? The map of Europe was changing, redrawn by the wars of revolution. Old certainties were dissolving. Monarchies that had seemed eternal were learning they could be defeated. Boundaries that had existed for centuries were becoming merely lines on paper, subject to revision by the will of victorious armies. And at the center of this transformation, at least in the Italian theatre, stood Napoleon Bonaparte, the young general from Corsica, whose ambition was beginning to match his ability, whose dreams were expanding to fill the space that history seemed to be offering him. In the quiet moments between campaigns and celebrations, Napoleon must have reflected on how far he had come. From the boy on the island to the conqueror of Italy, from the outsider mocked for his accent to the hero of the Republic. The revolution had opened doors for him, but he had walked through them with a determination and skill that was entirely his own. Italy was his first great achievement, but it would not be his last. The dream was growing, taking shape, and there was still so much world to conquer, so much destiny to fulfill. In the winter of 1798, Paris offered Napoleon many things: acclaim, political influence, the admiration of a public hungry for heroes. But France itself felt small to him now, constrained, a stage too familiar for the next act of his ambition. The Directory, watching this popular general with growing unease, was perhaps not sorry when Napoleon proposed a new campaign, one that would take him far from the corridors of French power. Egypt became the destination, a land of ancient mysteries and strategic importance. The plan had multiple justifications: to threaten British interests in India, to establish French influence in the East, to open trade routes and scientific opportunities. But beyond the strategic arguments, there was something else, a romantic pull toward a civilization that existed in Western imagination as both ancient wisdom and exotic possibility. Napoleon assembled an army, but not just an army. He brought scholars and scientists, artists and engineers, men who would study Egypt even as the soldiers conquered it. The Commission of Arts and Sciences numbered over 150 men: mathematicians, naturalists, chemists, antiquarians, artists. It was to be an invasion and an expedition of knowledge simultaneously, war and enlightenment, traveling together across the Mediterranean. The fleet sailed from Toulon in May 1798, hundreds of ships carrying 40,000 men and the instruments of both war and scholarship. The sea was calm, the wind favorable, and Napoleon spent the voyage reading, discussing philosophy with the savants, planning not just the conquest of Egypt, but its transformation, its entry into the modern world under French guidance. Malta fell first, the ancient stronghold of the Knights of St. John, surrendering after only token resistance. Napoleon took what was valuable, reorganized what remained, and sailed on. The Mediterranean stretched before them, blue and infinite, carrying the expedition toward Africa, toward a civilization that had been old when Rome was young. They landed at Alexandria in early July, the ancient city of libraries and lighthouses, now part of the Ottoman Empire, but Egyptian in its bones. The assault was swift, the defenders overwhelmed by French professionalism and numbers. Napoleon entered the city as Alexander had millennia before, another conqueror from the West, drawn by the mystery and promise of Egypt. But the Egypt of 1798 was not the willing subject of conquest. The population, predominantly Muslim, viewed the French as infidels, occupiers, threats to their way of life. Napoleon's proclamations of respect for Islam, his claims to be a liberator from Mamluk oppression, met with skepticism. The religious scholars, the ulama, were not easily convinced that a foreign general represented their interests. The army marched toward Cairo through the desert, and the desert was revelation and trial both. The heat was fierce, water scarce, the horizon shimmering with mirages that promised relief but delivered only more sand, more burning sky. Soldiers unused to such conditions struggled, some collapsed, morale wavered under the weight of thirst and exhaustion. At Shubra Kit, the French encountered their first major opposition: Mamluk warriors, magnificent in their martial skills and courage, charging the French formations with swords and muskets, relying on individual prowess. But Napoleon's army fought in squares, modern European tactics and firepower against traditional cavalry warfare. The outcome was determined by technology and training. The Mamluks were repulsed with heavy losses. On July 21st, within sight of the pyramids of Giza, the Battle of the Pyramids unfolded. The Mamluk forces under Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey faced the French army, across the desert floor. Napoleon, before the battle, is said to have addressed his men, pointing to the ancient monuments and declaring that 40 centuries of history looked down upon them. Whether the words were exactly these matters less than the image they created. The revolutionary army of France, standing in the shadow of antiquity, about to add another chapter to the long story of human conflict. The battle followed the pattern of Shubra Kit, but on a larger scale. The Mamluks charged with tremendous courage, their horsemen resplendent in silk and weapons, but they broke against the disciplined fire of French infantry squares. Some tried to flank, others to break through by sheer determination, but modern warfare had evolved beyond individual heroism. By day's end, the Mamluk forces were shattered, and the road to Cairo was open. Napoleon entered Cairo as its new master, taking residence in a palace, beginning the work of administration and transformation. He established the Institut d'Égypte, a learned society where French savants could study Egypt's antiquities, its natural resources, its society. Scholars began the work that would later be published as the Description de l'Égypte, a massive compilation of knowledge that would open Egypt to European understanding, even as it served the purposes of imperial control. But even as Napoleon organized and studied, the strategic situation deteriorated. The British Navy, under Admiral Nelson, had been searching for the French fleet. In early August, Nelson found it anchored in Aboukir Bay near Alexandria. The Battle of the Nile was a catastrophe for France. The British attacked at sunset, catching the French ships unprepared, and by dawn most of the French fleet was destroyed or captured. Napoleon's army was victorious in Egypt, but stranded there, cut off from France, from reinforcement, from the possibility of easy return. Napoleon received the news with outward calm, though it must have struck him like a physical blow. He was isolated now, his grand expedition transformed from a bold strategic move into a potential disaster. But characteristic of the man, he responded by pressing forward rather than contemplating retreat. If he could not easily leave Egypt, then he would make Egypt itself the base for greater achievements. The occupation settled into an uneasy rhythm. French soldiers stationed in Cairo lived among a population that remained largely hostile. Uprisings occurred, brutally suppressed. The French brought their ideas of rational administration, attempted to modernize tax collection and governance, but these efforts often clashed with local customs and religious sensibilities. Napoleon tried to position himself as a friend to Islam, attending mosques, consulting with religious leaders, but the gap between conqueror and liberator could not be bridged by gestures alone. The savants, meanwhile, pursued their studies with dedication. They measured the Sphinx, explored the Valley of the Kings, copied hieroglyphs that no European could yet read, collected specimens of plants and animals. In their work lay the seeds of Egyptology, the systematic study of ancient Egyptian civilization. The Rosetta Stone, discovered by French soldiers in July 1799, would later provide the key to deciphering hieroglyphs, unlocking 3,000 years of history. In February 1799, Napoleon led his army into Syria, ostensibly to forestall an Ottoman attack, but perhaps also driven by the same ambition that had brought him to Egypt, the desire to expand, to conquer, to write his name across territories that existed in Western imagination as biblical and ancient. The campaign began with successes. Jaffa fell after a siege, though the aftermath was marked by acts of harsh retribution against the garrison. But at Acre, a fortified city on the coast, Napoleon met an obstacle he could not overcome. The city was defended by Ottoman forces assisted by a French émigré officer and, crucially, by British naval support that allowed resupply and reinforcement from the sea. Napoleon's army besieged Acre for 2 months, launching assault after assault against its walls. Disease spread through the French camp, plague striking down men already weakened by months of campaigning in harsh conditions. Napoleon himself visited the plague hospitals, touching the sick in a gesture meant to show fearlessness and solidarity, a moment that would be immortalized in paintings that served his legend. But the gesture could not change the military reality. Acre held, and in May, Napoleon made the difficult decision to lift the siege and retreat to Egypt. The march back was difficult, the army carrying its wounded and sick through desert and coastal paths, harassed by enemy forces, suffering from shortage of supplies. They reached Egypt diminished in numbers and health, the Syrian campaign a failure that Napoleon would later try to recast as a tactical withdrawal, a limited operation that achieved its defensive purposes even if it fell short of grander ambitions. In Egypt, Napoleon received disturbing news from Europe. France was again facing military reversals. The Directory was unpopular and weak. Political instability threatened the revolution itself. The letters from Paris, those that made it through the British blockade, painted a picture of a nation in crisis, in need of strong leadership. In August 1799, Napoleon made his decision. He would return to France, leaving his army under the command of General Kleber. It was, by any measure, an abandonment, a general leaving his men stranded in a foreign land, cut off from home. But Napoleon justified it by higher necessity. France needed him, and Egypt was a theatre that had played its course, at least for his purposes. The departure was secretive, a small group of officers and savants boarding ships in the night, evading British patrols through luck and skill. They sailed across the Mediterranean, past Sicily and Sardinia, finally reaching France in October. Napoleon had been gone for 16 months, and in that time he had conquered a country, lost a fleet, campaigned through deserts and sieges, and gathered materials for a legend that would outlast the actual achievements. Egypt, for Napoleon, was many things. It was a strategic gambit that failed in its larger objectives, but succeeded in removing him from the political constraints of Paris at a crucial moment. It was a romantic adventure, a journey to lands that fired the European imagination, a campaign accompanied by scholars and meant to serve enlightenment as well as empire. It was a demonstration of his ability to improvise and adapt, to turn setbacks into opportunities for further action. But perhaps most importantly, Egypt was a story, a narrative that Napoleon helped shape even as it unfolded. The bulletins he sent back to France emphasized victories and minimized defeats, painted the expedition in colors of glory and scientific achievement. The savants who returned with him brought knowledge and artifacts that would fill museums and books, making Egypt newly visible to European eyes, even as the military occupation ultimately failed. The army he left behind in Egypt would struggle on for another 2 years before finally evacuating in 1801. their expedition ending not in triumph, but in negotiated withdrawal. Many of the soldiers who had sailed with such hope from Toulon would never see France again, their bones left in Egyptian soil, a cost that Napoleon's legend would obscure, but that was no less real for being forgotten. As Napoleon's ship approached the French coast, he must have reflected on what Egypt had meant, on what he had gained and lost in the sands and cities of that ancient land. He had gone seeking glory and strategic advantage, and he returned with his reputation intact, even enhanced, despite the ultimate failure of the expedition. The dream had survived contact with reality, and now he was returning to France at precisely the moment when the nation's instability created opportunity for a man of ambition and ability. The Mediterranean fell away behind his ship, and ahead lay France, a country that didn't yet know it was about to transform again, that the returning general would not simply rejoin the existing order, but would reshape it entirely. Egypt was behind him now, a chapter closed, but the legend born there would continue to grow, part of the mythology that surrounded Napoleon, that made him seem larger than life, a man who had walked among pyramids and conquered Pharaoh's lands, even if the reality was more complex and less successful than the stories would suggest. France in October 1799 was a nation exhausted by a decade of revolution, weary of instability, hungry for order. The Directory, the five-man executive that had governed since 1795, was widely seen as corrupt and ineffective. Military defeats abroad had tarnished its prestige, economic problems plagued the nation, and factionalism threatened to tear apart what the revolution had built. Napoleon landed at Fréjus and made his way to Paris, traveling through towns where crowds gathered to cheer him. News of his return spread faster than his carriage could travel, and by the time he reached the capital, anticipation hung in the air like weather about to break. He was the successful general, the conqueror of Italy, the hero of Egypt, conveniently arrived at the moment France seemed to need him most. He found a conspiracy already forming, men of various factions united by their desire to overthrow the Directory, though divided on what should replace it. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, one of the directors and a political theorist of the revolution, was the principal architect. He wanted a new constitution, a government that would combine stability with republican principles, and he needed a general to ensure military support. Napoleon, with his prestige and his popularity, was the perfect instrument. But Napoleon was not a man to be anyone's instrument for long. He joined the conspiracy, lent it his name and his authority. But he was already planning to turn it to his own purposes. The plotters thought they were using Napoleon. They would discover they had misjudged who was using whom. The coup was set for the 18th of Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, November 9th in the old reckoning. The plan was to move the legislature to Saint-Cloud, outside Paris, ostensibly for its own protection from a fictional Jacobin plot. There, away from the Paris crowds, the government could be reorganized without interference. The Council of Elders was convinced to authorize the move, and the military, under Napoleon's influence, would ensure compliance. On the appointed day, the machinery of the coup began to move. The legislators gathered at Saint-Cloud, confused and suspicious. Napoleon, dressed in civilian clothes, rather than his general's uniform, a gesture meant to emphasize his republican credentials, addressed first the Council of Elders, then the Council of 500. But his speeches were uncharacteristically poor, nervous, and rambling, failing to convince the assembled deputies. In the Council of 500, the younger and more radical of the two chambers, opposition crystallized. Deputies surrounded Napoleon, shouting denunciations, some calling for him to be outlawed, a declaration that would have made him an enemy of the state. There were moments of physical confrontation. Napoleon was jostled, possibly struck. His brother Lucien, serving as president of the council, struggled to maintain order. Napoleon withdrew, shaken, the coup teetering on the edge of failure. But outside, his brother Lucien emerged and addressed the grenadiers guarding the assembly. He claimed that assassins had attacked Napoleon, that the deputies were in the grip of terrorists. In a dramatic gesture, he drew his sword and swore to use it against his own brother if Napoleon ever threatened French liberty. It was theatre, calculated and effective. The grenadiers, believing their general threatened, entered the chamber. The deputies fled through windows and doors. The assembly dissolved in chaos and fear. The coup almost failed, succeeded through improvisation and the willingness of soldiers to trust their general over civilian politicians. By evening, the remnants of the legislature, purged of opposition, voted to create a new provisional government, a consulate of 3, with Napoleon as first consul. It had been clumsy, nearly disastrous, but it had worked. The Directory was finished, and a new government was being born. Within weeks, a new constitution was drafted, submitted to a plebiscite, approved by overwhelming margins. Whether through genuine support or managed voting mattered less than the appearance of popular consent. Napoleon was first consul, effectively the ruler of France, while maintaining the forms of republican government. He took up residence in the Tuileries Palace, the same building where kings had lived, where the Revolution had attacked monarchy, now the home of the first consul. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. Republican France had a new master, and that master was acquiring the trappings of royal power while eschewing the title. Napoleon set about the work of governing with the same energy he had brought to military campaigns. France needed to be reorganized, its administration rationalized, its finances stabilized, its society reconciled after a decade of revolutionary upheaval. He worked long hours, presided over meetings of the Council of State, involved himself in details from military strategy to the design of new civil codes. The Code Napoleon, the civil legal code that bears his name, began to take shape in these years. It was a codification of law that drew on Roman precedent, revolutionary principles, and practical necessity. It established equality before the law, protected property rights, secularized marriage and divorce, and created a legal framework that would be exported across Europe and influence legal systems far beyond France's borders. Napoleon himself participated in the discussions, contributing his own perspective, his belief in order and clarity, his conviction that law should be accessible and rational. Peace was another priority. France had been at war almost continuously since 1792, and the nation was exhausted. Austria still fought, supported by Britain, but the military situation was favorable to France after recent victories. Napoleon offered peace terms, and when Austria hesitated, he prepared for war. In the spring of 1800, he led an army across the Alps, repeating Hannibal's legendary feat, moving men and artillery through mountain passes still choked with snow. At Marengo in June, French and Austrian forces met in a battle that swung from near disaster to dramatic victory. The Austrians initially had the advantage, pushing the French back, and Napoleon himself at one point considered retreat. But the arrival of General Desire with reinforcements late in the day turned the tide. Desire was killed in the moment of victory, but his arrival saved the battle, and Marengo became another chapter in Napoleon's legend of providential triumph. Austria sued for peace, and the Treaty of Lunéville in 1801 confirmed French dominance in northern Italy and along the Rhine. Britain remained at war, but isolated, and in 1802 the Treaty of Amiens brought even British agreement to peace, though it would prove temporary. For a brief moment, France was at peace with all of Europe, an achievement that increased Napoleon's prestige and allowed him to consolidate power at home. Domestically, Napoleon pursued policies of reconciliation and centralization. The émigrés, nobles who had fled France during the Revolution, were invited to return if they accepted the new order. The Catholic Church, suppressed during the Revolution, was brought back into French life through the Concordat of 1801, an agreement with Pope Pius VII that recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens while maintaining state control over the Church's temporal affairs. These policies antagonized some revolutionaries who saw in them a betrayal of revolutionary principles. But Napoleon was constructing a new synthesis, taking what he found useful from both revolutionary and ancien régime traditions, discarding what did not serve his vision of France as a modern, efficient, powerful state. He was less interested in ideological purity than in what worked, in building a system that could support French power and his own authority. The machinery of the state was reorganized along more centralized lines. Prefects, appointed by Paris, governed departments, replacing the elected local authorities of earlier revolutionary governments. The lycées, state secondary schools, were established to train future administrators and officers, creating a new elite based on merit and service to the state. The Bank of France was founded to stabilize currency and credit. Napoleon's France was becoming a state organized for efficiency and control, republican in name, but increasingly authoritarian in practice. In 1802, another plebiscite made Napoleon consul for life, an office that resembled elective monarchy in all but name. Each step was presented as the will of the people, as necessary for France's stability and greatness, and each step took Napoleon further from the revolutionary ideals of shared power and closer to personal rule. He worked from early morning to late at night, dictating correspondence, reviewing reports, making decisions on matters large and small. His energy seemed inexhaustible, his capacity for detail phenomenal. Ministers marveled at his ability to master brief on complex subjects, to ask penetrating questions, to see connections others missed. But this same intensity could be overwhelming. His temper could flare at incompetence or opposition. His dismissal of those who disagreed could be cutting. France under the consulate was transforming, becoming more ordered, more prosperous, more powerful. The chaos of the revolutionary decade was being replaced by a system that was efficient and increasingly authoritarian. Napoleon told himself, and told France, that this was what the revolution had been for: to create a nation based on merit and reason, to sweep away the irrational privileges of the old regime. That the nation was now under the control of one man, that liberty was being sacrificed for order, these were contradictions that Napoleon either did not see or chose not to acknowledge. In quiet moments in the palace that had once housed kings, Napoleon might have reflected on how far he had come. From artillery captain to first consul, from outsider to the most powerful man in France, the journey had been rapid, improbable, the product of talent and opportunity seized with both hands. But the dream was not complete. There was still further to go, still greater heights to reach. France was his now, but his ambition was beginning to look beyond France, to see himself not just as the ruler of a nation, but as something more, something that history had not seen in 1,000 years. The year 1804 began with France at peace and prosperous, Napoleon secure in his power as consul for life. But security was not enough. Prosperity was not the dream's fulfillment. There were practical reasons to seek a more permanent, more hereditary form of authority. Plots against Napoleon's life had been discovered, most notably the Cadoudal conspiracy, which aimed to assassinate him and restore the Bourbon monarchy. If Napoleon died, what would happen to the stability he had created? The question demanded an answer that went beyond republican forms. The imperial title offered a solution. It would be hereditary, ensuring succession and stability. But it would not be a simple restoration of the old monarchy. Napoleon would not be King of France, a title too associated with the Bourbons and the Ancien Régime, but Emperor of the French, a title that evoked Rome rather than the medieval past, that suggested a new kind of sovereignty based on popular will rather than divine right. The path to empire was paved with the usual mechanisms of consent. The Senate proposed the change, the question was put to a plebiscite, and the people, so the official results claimed, approved overwhelmingly. On May 18, 1804, the Senate proclaimed Napoleon Bonaparte Emperor of the French. The Revolution's promise of equality had produced an emperor, though one who claimed to rule through merit and popular sovereignty rather than ancient bloodlines. The coronation was set for December 2nd, 1804, at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Months of preparation followed. The ceremony must be magnificent, must communicate both continuity and rupture, must place Napoleon in a line of historical greatness while emphasizing his uniqueness. Pope Pius VII was invited to perform the ceremony, lending religious legitimacy to the new empire, though the relationship between emperor and pope would prove complex and eventually contentious. The cathedral was transformed for the occasion, hung with tapestries and symbols of the new empire, the bees that Napoleon had chosen as his emblem, the eagles that recalled Roman legions. Throne platforms were erected, a path was cleared for the procession, and artists were commissioned to record the moment for posterity. December 2nd arrived cold and clear. Paris awoke to the sound of cannon fire announcing the great day. The procession began in the late morning, Napoleon and Josephine in a golden coach drawn by 8 horses, moving through streets lined with soldiers and crowds, heading toward the cathedral where the Pope and the assembled dignitaries waited. Inside Notre Dame, the ceremony unfolded according to the carefully planned script. The Pope blessed the crown and the Emperor, but when the moment came for the actual coronation, Napoleon departed from tradition. Rather than being crowned by the Pope, Napoleon took the crown from the altar and placed it on his own head. Then he took a smaller crown and placed it on Josephine's head, making her empress. The gesture was symbolic. Napoleon crowned himself, acknowledging no authority higher than his own, though he allowed the Pope's presence to sanctify the moment. The message was clear to those who understood such symbolism. Napoleon's authority came from himself, from his achievements, from the will of the French people as expressed through plebiscite, not from the church or from dynastic succession. He was creating a new kind of sovereignty, one that combined the forms of monarchy with the revolutionary principle that power derived from the nation rather than from God. The ceremony lasted for hours, a spectacle of silk and ermine, of crowns and scepters, of religious ritual and imperial theatre. Jacques-Louis David, the great painter who had celebrated the revolution and now served the empire, was present, sketching the scene that he would later transform into a massive painting, a work that would fix the coronation in collective memory, making the event both historical fact and artistic legend. After the cathedral ceremony, the celebrations continued. Paris was illuminated, fireworks painted the night sky, and the people were given spectacle and pageantry, a glimpse of glory to replace the austere virtue that revolution had promised but never quite delivered. France had an emperor now, and the empire announced itself in gold and light, in cannon salutes and solemn oaths. But what did it mean, this transformation from republic to empire? For Napoleon, it was the logical culmination of his rise, the final form that his authority needed to take to ensure stability and continuation. He had saved France from chaos, had brought order and prosperity, and now he was ensuring that this achievement would outlast him, that there would be a Bonaparte dynasty to carry France forward. For France, the meanings were more varied. Some saw betrayal, the revolution's promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity reduced to the ambitions of one man. Others saw necessity, a strong hand to guide France in a dangerous world. Many simply accepted it, as they had accepted so many transformations over the past 15 years, one more change in a period when change seemed the only constant. The old revolutionaries, those who had survived the Terror and the Thermidorian reaction, the Directory and the Consulate, watched the coronation with complex emotions. They had fought to end monarchy, and now they were subjects of an emperor, though he was an emperor who had risen from merit rather than birth, an emperor who claimed to embody the revolution's true principles even as he donned a crown. Europe's monarchies watched with alarm and contempt mixed with a grudging recognition of the reality. This upstart Corsican, this product of revolution, was now claiming equality with ancient dynasties. Austria's emperor was affronted, Russia's Tsar was wary, Britain's king dismissed Napoleon as a usurper. But they would all have to deal with him. This emperor who commanded the most powerful army in Europe and whose ambitions showed no sign of reaching their limit. In the Tuileries Palace, after the ceremonies were complete, Napoleon might have stood alone for a moment, feeling the weight of the crown, the burden and the achievement it represented. He had come so far from Corsica, from the artillery academies, from the siege of Toulon and the campaign in Italy. He was emperor now. The dream had taken form, but the dream was also changing, expanding, becoming something that even he might not fully recognize. The coronation was not an ending, but a beginning. An emperor needed an empire, and France, however powerful, was not enough. Napoleon's eye was already turning to the rest of Europe, to kingdoms and territories that must acknowledge his supremacy or face his armies. The dream of empire was becoming a dream of domination, of a Europe reorganized under French influence, with Napoleon at its center, the sun around which all other powers would orbit. But such dreams have their own logic, their own momentum. Each success demands another. Each victory requires further victories to secure it. Napoleon was emperor, but the title brought not satisfaction, but a new hunger, a need to prove the empire's legitimacy through achievement, to make France so powerful, himself so dominant, that no one could question his right to the crown he had placed on his own head. The candles in Notre Dame had burned down. The crowds had dispersed. The Pope had returned to his lodgings, contemplating this strange new emperor who honored the Church but claimed authority independent of it. Paris settled into sleep, and the empire began its work, consolidating, expanding, reaching toward a horizon that seemed to recede even as Napoleon marched toward it. The empire, once proclaimed, demanded substance. Napoleon set about creating it with the same methodical intensity he brought to all his endeavors. Europe in 1805 wasn't ready to accept a French emperor, a revolutionary general crowned with imperial purple, and so Europe would have to be persuaded, through diplomacy where possible, through force where necessary. Britain remained unreconciled. The Peace of Amiens had broken down in 1803, and the British Navy again blockaded French ports, strangling trade and isolating the continent from global commerce. Napoleon assembled an army at Boulogne, looking across the Channel, planning an invasion of England that would end British opposition once and for all. Barges were built, troops drilled in embarkation procedures, and the Grand Army took shape, the finest military force Napoleon had yet commanded. But the invasion never came. To cross the Channel, Napoleon needed naval superiority, even temporarily, and this he could not achieve. The French and Spanish fleets combined should have been sufficient, but British naval skill and the aggressive tactics of admirals like Nelson prevented the concentration of force needed to cover an invasion. In October 1805, at Trafalgar off the Spanish coast, Nelson destroyed the combined Franco-Spanish fleet, securing British naval dominance for the rest of the wars. Nelson died in the moment of victory, but his triumph doomed Napoleon's invasion plans. Napoleon turned his attention from the sea to the land, from England to Austria and Russia, who had formed a new coalition with British subsidies. The Grand Army marched east from Boulogne, moving with a speed and precision that bewildered opponents accustomed to slower, more ponderous military operations. In October, at Ulm, an Austrian army was surrounded and forced to surrender almost without a fight, a masterpiece of maneuver that eliminated one of the coalition armies before the main campaign even began. Vienna fell in November, Napoleon entering the Habsburg capital as he had entered Milan and Cairo, another ancient seat of power yielding to French arms. But the occupation of capitals did not end wars. The Russian and remaining Austrian forces were still in the field, and the decisive battle had yet to be fought. It came at Austerlitz in December, on the first anniversary of the coronation. Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, inviting the Allied forces to attack there, then crushed the attack with reserves he had hidden, while his left wing cut the Allied army in two. It was a tactical masterpiece, perhaps Napoleon's greatest victory, and it shattered the Third Coalition. Austria sued for peace, Russia withdrew eastward, and Napoleon's reputation as a military genius reached its zenith. The Peace of Pressburg that followed redrew the map of Europe. Austria ceded territories. The Holy Roman Empire, that ancient institution dating back to Charlemagne, was dissolved. Napoleon created client states. The Confederation of the Rhine brought German princes under French protection, and the Kingdom of Italy, with Napoleon as its king, formalized French control over northern Italy. Europe was being reorganized according to Napoleonic principles. Old boundaries, established by centuries of dynastic inheritance and religious settlement, meant nothing against the will of a victorious emperor. New kingdoms appeared, relatives and marshals of Napoleon placed on thrones, satellite states that extended French influence without the burden of direct administration. Prussia, which had remained neutral during the Austerlitz campaign, watched these changes with growing alarm. By 1806, Prussian patience ran out, and the kingdom that Frederick the Great had made into a military power challenged Napoleon. The challenge was met with devastating swiftness. At Jena and Auerstedt in October, the Prussian army, still organized on the principles of the previous century, was annihilated by French forces moving with revolutionary speed and élan. Napoleon entered Berlin in triumph, and from there issued the Berlin Decree, beginning the Continental System, an economic blockade meant to strangle British trade. If he could not invade England, he would isolate it, cut it off from European markets, force it to peace through economic pressure. It was an ambitious plan, requiring control of all European coasts, absolute enforcement of the blockade, and the willing cooperation of states that depended on British trade. Its success would never match its ambition. Russia still fought, the last of the coalition partners, retreating eastward, drawing Napoleon deeper into Eastern Europe. At Eylau in February 1807, French and Russian forces fought in a snowstorm, a brutal, indecisive battle that left tens of thousands dead and Napoleon sobered by the cost of victory. But in June, at Friedland, Napoleon achieved a clear victory, and Tsar Alexander I agreed to meet and discuss peace. They met at Tilsit, on a raft in the middle of the Neman River, halfway between their armies, a meeting that symbolized the division of Europe into spheres of influence. Napoleon and Alexander talked, found they could work together, or at least agree to partition the continent between them. The Treaty of Tilsit in July 1807 brought Russia into alliance with France, closed Russian ports to British goods, and allowed Napoleon a free hand in Western and Central Europe. At 38, Napoleon stood at the pinnacle of his power. He controlled France, Italy, the Low Countries, and much of Germany. Spain remained an ally, Russia a partner, Austria defeated, Prussia occupied, Britain isolated. The dream of empire was realized. Europe was his, organized according to his vision, acknowledging his supremacy. But empires must be administered as well as conquered. Napoleon worked to standardize laws, to improve roads and infrastructure, to spread the code Napoleon and French administrative practices. Wherever French influence reached, feudalism was abolished, legal equality proclaimed, meritocracy promoted. These were the revolutionary principles exported by imperial power, a contradiction Napoleon seemed not to notice or chose to ignore. Art and architecture celebrated the empire. The Arc de Triomphe was planned, though it would not be completed in Napoleon's lifetime, a monument to French military glory. The Louvre expanded with treasures from conquered territories, artworks that flowed to Paris as they once flowed to Rome. Paris itself was transformed, new streets, new monuments, becoming an imperial capital worthy of its emperor. The imperial court developed its own rituals and hierarchy. The old revolutionary simplicity gave way to ceremony and protocol. Marshals of the empire became princes and dukes, enriched with lands and honors. A new nobility emerged, based not on ancient lineage, but on service to Napoleon, though the distinction between this and the old aristocracy became increasingly blurred as time passed. Napoleon's family became Europe's royalty. Joseph was king of Naples, then of Spain. Louis became king of Holland. Jerome was given Westphalia. Caroline and her husband Murat received Naples when Joseph moved to Spain. Elisa governed Tuscany. Only Lucien, who had refused to divorce his wife for a political match, remained outside the imperial system, a choice that Napoleon never quite forgave. But the expansion brought strains. Each territory added to the empire required garrisoning, administration, enforcement of the continental system. The empire was vast, stretching from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. But vastness brought vulnerability. Long supply lines, resentful populations, the constant need for military presence to maintain control, these were the costs of empire that Napoleon's genius could not wholly overcome. In Spain, beginning in 1808, the empire found its bleeding wound. Napoleon had placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, removing the Spanish Bourbons, expecting Spain to accept this change as other nations had accepted his reorganizations. But Spain resisted. A popular uprising against French occupation, a guerrilla war that would drain French resources and morale for years. British forces, under the future Duke of Wellington, landed in Portugal and could not be dislodged, providing a base for operations against French forces in the peninsula. Austria, watching French difficulties in Spain, saw opportunity and attacked again in 1809. Napoleon rushed back from Spain, raised new armies, and defeated Austria at Wagram in July. But the victory was costly, and Austria's resistance showed that the empire's opponents would keep trying, waiting for the moment when Napoleon's attention was divided or his forces overextended. Still, from 1807 to 1811, the empire seemed secure, powerful, the dominant force in European affairs. Napoleon divorced Josephine, who had given him no heir, and married Marie-Louise of Austria, the daughter of the emperor he had defeated, binding the upstart Bonaparte dynasty to one of Europe's most ancient houses. In 1811, a son was born, the King of Rome, an heir to carry forward the Imperial project, ensuring that the empire would outlast its founder. The dream had expanded beyond anything the young lieutenant of artillery could have imagined. Napoleon was not simply the ruler of France, but the master of Europe, his word law from Madrid to Warsaw, his will shaping the lives of millions. He had taken the revolution's energy and channeled it into empire, created a new order in Europe that seemed, for a moment, as permanent as the old order it had replaced. But empires built by one man's will are fragile in ways that their builders seldom recognize. They depend on continued victory, on the perception of invincibility, on the fear and respect that success engenders. Let that perception crack, let a defeat become visible, and the whole structure can begin to crumble, allies becoming enemies, subjects becoming rebels, the edifice of power revealing itself to be less solid than it appeared. Napoleon, in the Tuileries, in the palaces of Milan and Amsterdam and Warsaw, surrounded by maps and reports, directing the affairs of a continent, perhaps felt the dream complete. But the dream was already beginning to turn, to shift into something else, to carry within it the seeds of its own undoing. The expansion could not continue forever, and what cannot expand must eventually contract. The empire had reached its greatest extent, and though no one yet knew it, the tide was about to turn. In the spring of 1812, the Grand Army assembled in Poland, the largest force Napoleon had ever commanded. Over 600,000 men, drawn from France and from every corner of the empire and its allied states, converged on the Niemen River, the boundary between Napoleon's Europe and the vast expanse of Russia. It was meant to be the final campaign, the war that would bring Tsar Alexander back into alliance, that would close the last gap in the continental system, that would make Napoleon's mastery of Europe complete and unchallengeable. The reasons for the campaign were complex, rooted in Alexander's growing independence, his secret trade with Britain, his refusal to fully enforce the continental system. But perhaps the deeper reason was Napoleon's own nature, his inability to accept anything less than total dominance, his belief that one more victory would secure the empire forever. The army crossed the Niemen on June 24th, entering Russian territory without a declaration of war, an invasion presented as a defensive necessity, a response to Russian provocations. The columns stretched for miles, French veterans marching alongside Polish lancers, German auxiliaries, Italian regiments, Dutch and Swiss and Croatian units, a polyglot force representing the diversity of Napoleon's empire. The Russians did not stand and fight. Instead, they retreated, drawing the French deeper into their vast territory, abandoning towns and countryside, leaving little for the invading army to requisition. It was a frustrating pursuit, the French columns marching through heat and dust, supplies growing stretched, the decisive battle always just beyond reach. At Smolensk in August, the Russians made a stand, but the battle was inconclusive, and the retreat continued. Napoleon captured the city, but not the Russian army, and the campaign that was supposed to be swift and decisive was dragging on, consuming resources, scattering the Grand Army across the Russian landscape as detachments pursued different Russian forces or guarded the ever-lengthening supply lines. The distance from the Niemen to Moscow was over 400 miles, and every mile took the French further from their base, deeper into a country that seemed to swallow armies without effort. The heat of summer gave way to cooler weather, and still the Russians retreated, refusing the decisive engagement that Napoleon needed to force peace. On September 7th, at Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow, the Russians finally stood and fought. It was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, over 70,000 casualties in a battle that resolved nothing strategically. The French held the field at day's end, and the Russians withdrew. But it was a Pyrrhic victory, the Grand Army bleeding itself for a few miles of advance. Moscow appeared on the horizon a week later, its golden domes gleaming in the September sun. Napoleon expected the fall of the Russian capital to bring Alexander to terms, as the fall of Vienna and Berlin had brought other rulers to peace. The army entered the city, finding it largely abandoned. The population fled or evacuated, and that evening, fires began. Whether set by Russian patriots or by accident among the wooden buildings, the fires spread rapidly, consuming much of the city over the next 3 days. The French watched Moscow burn, the great capital that was supposed to be their triumph, and their winter quarters transformed into a charred ruin. Warehouses of supplies they had counted on went up in smoke. Shelter for the coming winter disappeared in flames. Napoleon waited in Moscow for Alexander to negotiate. Days became weeks, September became October, and no message came from the Tsar. The situation was deteriorating. Supplies were running low. The army was living off a burned city, and the Russian autumn was advancing toward winter. Still, Napoleon hesitated, unwilling to admit defeat by retreating, hoping that Alexander would yet see reason and agree to peace. On October 19th, the decision could no longer be delayed. The Grand Army began its retreat from Moscow, taking the southern route, hoping to find a region less devastated by war. But the Russians harried the columns, Cossacks attacking stragglers and foragers, regular forces threatening the line of march. At Maloyaroslavets, the French fought their way through, but at a cost that forced Napoleon to take the northern route after all, the same path of devastation they had created on the advance. The weather held for a few weeks, allowing the retreat to proceed in relatively good order. But in early November, the cold arrived in earnest, temperatures plunging below freezing, snow beginning to fall. The army was not prepared for Russian winter, clothing was inadequate, horses began dying in large numbers, and the soldiers, already weakened by months of campaigning and irregular rations, started to succumb to cold and exhaustion. The retreat became a nightmare of suffering. Men froze to death in their sleep, horses collapsed and were butchered for food. Discipline began to dissolve as soldiers abandoned their units to seek shelter or sustenance. The Guard, Napoleon's elite, maintained better order, but the rest of the army was fracturing, becoming a refugee column more than a military force. At the Berezina River in late November, the army faced potential annihilation. The Russians were converging from multiple directions, and the river was partially frozen, too icy for boats, but not solid enough to cross on foot. French engineers worked in the freezing water to build 2 bridges, men dying of hypothermia as they labored, but they succeeded, and the army crossed under fire, losing thousands but escaping the trap. The cold intensified as the army staggered westward. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius and below. a cold beyond the experience of most of these men from temperate climates. Fingers and toes turned black with frostbite. Men simply sat down in the snow and did not rise again. The column left a trail of frozen bodies marking its path across the Russian landscape. Napoleon's bulletins sent back to France admitted disaster but minimized its scale, preparing French public opinion for bad news while maintaining the fiction of imperial control. In early December, in Smorgon, Napoleon made the decision to leave the army and return to Paris. His presence was needed in the capital. Rumors were spreading. Enemies might see opportunity in his absence, and the empire needed to see that its emperor had survived. He traveled in a closed sleigh, moving rapidly westward with a small party, leaving Marshal Murat in command of the remnant of the Grand Army. The journey took 2 weeks through cold and hostile territory, but Napoleon reached Paris on December 18th, appearing suddenly at the Tuileries, his survival and return a propaganda victory, even as the army he had abandoned continued its agonizing retreat. The Grand Army that finally staggered across the Niemen in mid-December numbered perhaps 40,000 men, a fraction of the 600,000 that had crossed eastward 6 months before. The rest were dead, captured, or dispersed across Russia and Eastern Europe, the greatest military disaster in modern history up to that time. The myth of French invincibility was shattered, and across Europe, nations that had submitted to Napoleon began to reconsider their positions. Russia itself was devastated, its countryside ravaged, Moscow burned, casualties in the hundreds of thousands. But Russia had survived, and in surviving had defeated the greatest army Europe had seen. The cold had been an ally, but more important was the Russian willingness to sacrifice, to trade space for time, to endure suffering in service of ultimate victory. The campaign demonstrated the limits of Napoleonic warfare, how brilliant tactics and operational art could not overcome strategic overreach, how even genius could not transcend the constraints of logistics and geography. Napoleon had pushed too far, demanded too much of his army and his empire, and the Russian winter had revealed the fragility beneath the imperial grandeur. In Paris, Napoleon immediately began raising a new army, calling up younger conscripts, recalling veterans, scraping together forces to replace what had been lost. His energy was undiminished, his will to continue fighting unshaken. But something had changed. The empire's enemies now knew that Napoleon could be beaten, that French armies could be destroyed, that the emperor was not invincible. The snow in Russia continued to fall through that winter, covering the frozen bodies of soldiers from a dozen nations, from France and Poland, Italy and Germany, all drawn into the vortex of Napoleon's ambition. The white landscape erased the tracks of armies, softened the harsh lines of disaster into gentle contours. Nature reclaimed what empire had tried to conquer, and the vastness of Russia, which had swallowed the Grand Army, returned to its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the dreams and disasters of men. The dream of empire, which had seemed so close to realization, had struck against something it could not overcome. Not another army, not another general of genius, but distance and cold, the simple facts of geography and climate that no amount of tactical brilliance could negate. Napoleon would fight on, would win more battles, would demonstrate again his genius for war. But the Russian campaign marked the beginning of the end, the moment when the tide of empire reached its furthest extent and began, inexorably, to recede. The year 1813 opened with Napoleon in Paris, furiously rebuilding his armies, while across Europe his enemies gathered strength. The Russian disaster had broken the spell of French invincibility, and nations that had submitted now saw opportunity for liberation. Prussia broke its alliance with France and joined Russia. Austria waited and watched, and even the smaller German states began to reconsider their loyalty to the Confederation of the Rhine. Napoleon raised new armies with remarkable speed, calling up the class of 1814 a year early, pulling men from garrisons across the empire, creating forces on paper that approached his former strength. But these were not the veterans of Austerlitz and Jena. They were boys barely old enough to carry a musket, led by officers promoted too quickly to fill the gaps left by Russia, lacking the experience and skill that had made the Grand Army formidable. In the spring, Napoleon marched east again into Germany to confront the coalition forming against him. At Lützen in May, he defeated a Russo-Prussian force, demonstrating that his tactical genius remained intact. At Bautzen later that month, another victory, but neither battle was decisive. The enemy armies retreated intact, preserving their strength for continued resistance. An armistice was agreed in June, ostensibly to discuss peace, but really to give all sides time to prepare for the next phase of the war. Napoleon used the time to strengthen his forces, but his enemies used it more effectively, bringing Austria into the coalition, organizing their strategy, coordinating their movements. When fighting resumed in August, Napoleon faced not separate armies, but a unified coalition plan, multiple forces that would avoid battle when Napoleon was present, but attack his marshals when he was absent. The autumn campaign of 1813 unfolded across Saxony and Bohemia, a complex chess game where Napoleon's genius was diluted by the need to be everywhere at once. He won battles. At Dresden in August, he achieved a victory that recalled his earlier triumphs. But each victory was isolated, failing to break the coalition's will or their ability to field new forces. The decisive moment came at Leipzig in October, the Battle of Nations, where Napoleon faced the combined forces of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. For 3 days, fighting raged around the city, Napoleon's army slowly being compressed, casualties mounting, the odds against him growing. On the 3rd day, Saxon troops in Napoleon's army defected to the coalition mid-battle, a visible sign of the empire's fragmentation. Napoleon ordered retreat, and the army withdrew westward through Leipzig, crossing the Elster River. The retreat turned to disaster when the bridge was blown prematurely, trapping thousands on the wrong side of the river, leaving them to be captured or killed. The army that escaped was diminished, demoralized, its route back to France a long agony of harassment and hardship. As Napoleon retreated westward, his empire dissolved behind him. The Confederation of the Rhine collapsed, German states defecting to the coalition, welcoming Russian and Austrian troops as liberators rather than invaders. Holland threw off French rule. Spain was lost to Wellington's advancing British army. Italy was threatened, and only France itself remained, surrounded now by enemies advancing from every direction. The coalition offered peace terms, France could keep its natural frontiers, the Rhine and the Alps, but must abandon all claims to territories beyond. It was generous considering France's position, allowing Napoleon to remain emperor of a France still larger than it had been before the Revolution. But Napoleon hesitated, unable to accept the contraction of his empire, hoping for a victory that would restore his negotiating position, unable to distinguish between the possible and the desirable. By the time he decided to accept, the offer was withdrawn. The coalition, sensing final victory, advanced into France itself in January 1814. For the first time since the Revolution began, foreign armies crossed the French frontier not as defeated invaders, but as conquering forces, bringing war to the nation that had exported war across Europe for 2 decades. Napoleon conducted the defense of France with a genius born of desperation. With a small army of conscripts and veterans, he maneuvered across northeastern France, defeating coalition detachments at Champaubert, Montmirail, Montereau, achieving victories that recalled his earlier brilliance. But he could not be everywhere, and the coalition armies, though they suffered setbacks, continued to advance on Paris. The marshals were exhausted, the empire's resources depleted, and even Napoleon's energy could not substitute for armies he no longer possessed. At Arcis-sur-Aube in March, he fought a much larger coalition force to a standstill, but the effort cost him men he could not replace, and the enemy simply maneuvered around him, continuing their advance on the capital. Paris fell on March 31st, 1814, the coalition armies entering the city that had been the heart of the empire. Napoleon, racing to save his capital, arrived too late, finding it occupied and his cause lost. The Senate, under coalition pressure and seeing Napoleon's position as hopeless, declared him deposed. Marshals who had followed him for years now counselled abdication, seeing no path to continued resistance. On April 6th at Fontainebleau, Napoleon abdicated, first in favour of his son, the King of Rome, then unconditionally when it became clear the coalition would not accept a Bonaparte regency. The empire that had stretched across Europe, that had seemed permanent in its power, dissolved in a matter of weeks, reduced to memory, and the legal codes and administrative reforms it had scattered across the continent. The coalition powers offered Napoleon sovereignty over Elba, a small island off the Italian coast, a miniature kingdom for the former master of Europe. He accepted, the alternative being indefinite imprisonment or worse, and on April 20th he left Fontainebleau for the coast, beginning the journey to exile. The route to the Mediterranean took him through southern France, through regions where revolutionary sentiment had run strong, where the empire had been popular. But the mood had changed. Years of war and conscription had exhausted even French enthusiasm, and in some towns crowds threatened the former emperor, forcing him to disguise himself to pass safely. At Fréjus, where he had landed triumphant from Egypt 15 years before, Napoleon boarded the British frigate HMS Undaunted for the short voyage to Elba. He arrived on May 4th, 1814, and began his reign over an island of 12,000 inhabitants, a kingdom he could walk across in a day, a ruler whose domain could be seen entire from a single hilltop. Elba was beautiful, Mediterranean and mild, with views across the water to the Italian coast, and on clear days to to Corsica in the distance, the island of his birth visible from the island of his exile. Napoleon set about governing his miniature realm with the same energy he had brought to greater tasks, reforming administration, improving roads, developing mining operations, creating a small court and a tiny army. But Elba was a cage, however pleasant its climate and scenery. Napoleon received news from France, from Europe, learning that the restored Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII was unpopular, that the Congress of Vienna was redrawing Europe's boundaries with little regard for French interests, that his marshals and former officials were being sidelined or persecuted. The empire was gone, but the world it had created remained unstable, unsettled, perhaps ready for his return. Through the summer and autumn of 1814, Napoleon watched and waited. He received visitors, heard reports, maintained correspondence with supporters in France, and contemplated the gap between what he had been and what he had become. The emperor reduced to mayor of a small island, the master of Europe confined to a speck of land in the Mediterranean. It was a fall as dramatic as the rise had been, a reversal that would have broken lesser men. But Napoleon was not broken, only bent, and in the bending something was forming, a plan, or perhaps simply a refusal to accept that the story was finished. The man who had crowned himself emperor, who had remade Europe, who had led armies across continents, wasn't ready to end his days as a minor ruler remembered only for past glories. The dream had contracted to the size of Elba, but dreams have a way of expanding, of finding new forms, and Napoleon's dream was not yet done. The sea surrounded Elba, blue and constant, the waves marking time with their rhythm. Napoleon walked the island's paths, stood on its heights looking toward France, toward the life he had lost, and something stirred in him, a refusal, a determination, a belief that history had not finished with him yet. The fall had been precipitous, but perhaps it was not final. Perhaps there was still one more chapter to write, one more throw of the dice, one more attempt to seize destiny before it slipped away forever. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon slipped away from Elba with about 1,000 men, sailing north on a small flotilla that evaded the British ships meant to watch the island. The crossing to France was uneventful, and on March 1st he landed at Golfe Juan on the southern coast, the same shore where he had arrived from Egypt, where his rise to power had truly begun. The gamble was extraordinary. Napoleon was landing in France with a force barely large enough to be called an army, betting everything on the belief that France would rally to him, that the soldiers sent to arrest him would instead join him, that the empire could be restored by the mere fact of his presence. It was audacious to the point of madness, or perhaps it was the clearest vision of all, an understanding that his legend was itself a kind of power. The march north began, avoiding the royalist strongholds of Provence, taking mountain routes toward Grenoble and Lyon. At every town, Napoleon and his small force presented themselves, and at every town the same drama unfolded. The local authorities proclaimed their loyalty to King Louis XVIII. Troops were assembled to stop the usurper, and then, when Napoleon appeared, the soldiers hesitated, wavered, and joined him. At Grenoble, the garrison marched out to block the road. Napoleon walked toward them alone, opening his coat, presenting his chest, calling out to soldiers who had served under him. "If any of you wish to kill your emperor, here I am." No shot was fired. Instead, the cry went up, "Vive l'Empereur!" The soldiers rushed forward, surrounding Napoleon, and Grenoble opened its gates. The phenomenon repeated at Lyon, at every stage of the journey north. Marshal Ney, sent by Louis XVIII to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, pledged his loyalty to the king, then wept when he saw Napoleon and joined him with his troops. The Bourbons had returned with foreign armies, but Napoleon returned with memory and glory, and soldiers who had marched across Europe under his eagles could not bring themselves to fight against him. Louis XVIII fled Paris on March 19th, and on March 20th Napoleon entered the Tuileries, carried there on the shoulders of supporters, restored to power without firing a shot in anger. It had taken him 3 weeks to reconquer France, armed with little more than his name and the loyalty of men who remembered the empire's glory more than its disasters. But Europe was not about to accept Napoleon's return. The powers gathered at the Congress of Vienna, which had been redrawing the map of post-Napoleonic Europe, immediately declared him an outlaw, a disturber of the peace, and began assembling armies to remove him. The Seventh Coalition formed with unprecedented speed. Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, all committing forces to end the Napoleonic threat once and for all. Napoleon found France exhausted, the treasury empty, the population weary of war, but willing, at least for a moment, to believe that his return meant something better than Bourbon restoration. He set about raising armies, calling up veterans, organizing national guards, trying to recreate military force sufficient to defend France against all of Europe. He also attempted diplomacy, writing to the coalition powers, proclaiming his peaceful intentions, offering to respect the boundaries they had established. But no one believed him, or perhaps more accurately, no one cared whether he spoke truth or not. Napoleon's very existence threatened the European order they were trying to establish, and his removal was not negotiable. By June, armies were moving toward France from multiple directions, but the nearest and most immediate threats were the British forces under Wellington in Belgium and the Prussian army under Blucher. Napoleon decided to strike first, to defeat these armies separately before they could combine, using the strategic approach that had worked so often before. The Army of the North crossed into Belgium on June 15th, moving rapidly to get between Wellington and Blucher, to prevent their junction and defeat them in detail. At Quatre Bras and Ligny on June 16th, Napoleon achieved partial success, driving back the Prussians while his marshal fought the British to a standstill. But neither victory was decisive, and both enemy forces remained intact. On June 18th, near the village of Waterloo, Napoleon found Wellington's army positioned on a ridge, apparently ready to stand and fight. The Prussians were somewhere to the east, and Napoleon's calculations suggested they were too far away to intervene in a battle today. If he could destroy Wellington's army before the Prussians arrived, the campaign might still be won. The battle began late in the morning after rain-sodden ground dried enough for artillery to be effective. French attacks hammered against the British lines, which bent but did not break. Wellington's infantry, deployed on the reverse slope of the ridge, weathered artillery bombardments and repulsed cavalry charges, holding their positions with the stubborn endurance that characterized British troops. As the afternoon progressed, Prussian forces began arriving on the French right flank, earlier and in greater strength than Napoleon had calculated. He was forced to divert troops to hold them back, weakening the attacks on Wellington's position. The battle became a race. Could Napoleon break Wellington's line before the Prussians overwhelmed his flank? The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite reserve, was committed in a final attempt to break through. These veterans, who had never known defeat, advanced up the slope toward the British lines. But they were met with devastating fire, and for the first time the Guard recoiled, fell back, and the cry went up, "La Garde recule." The Guard retreats. The psychological effect was immediate. If the Guard could be broken, then the battle was lost, and the French army began to dissolve, retreat turning to rout as the Prussians pressed from the east and Wellington's forces advanced from the ridge. Napoleon himself was nearly captured in the chaos, but he escaped, riding through the night toward Paris, leaving behind an army shattered beyond immediate recovery. He reached Paris on June 21st to find the political situation collapsing as completely as the military. The Chamber of Representatives demanded his abdication, seeing no path forward with Napoleon at the helm. On June 22nd, for the second time, Napoleon abdicated, this time in favor of his son, though he must have known the gesture was futile. The 100 days were over. The gamble had failed, and this time there would be no gentle exile to a pleasant Mediterranean island. The British took custody of Napoleon, determined to ensure he could never again disturb the peace of Europe. He hoped to find asylum in Britain, to live out his days as a gentleman farmer in England. But the British government had other plans. HMS Bellerophon carried Napoleon to Britain, where crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the fallen emperor, but he was not permitted to land. Instead, the decision was made to send him to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, a place from which escape would be impossible, where he could live out his remaining years far from Europe and any opportunity to influence events. The 100 days demonstrated both Napoleon's enduring appeal and the limits of that appeal. He could reconquer France through the loyalty of soldiers and the memory of glory, but he could not defeat all of Europe, could not recreate the empire through force of will alone. The world had moved on, and while individuals might follow him, nations were determined to move forward without him. As he prepared to leave for St. Helena, transferring to HMS Northumberland for the long voyage south, Napoleon might have reflected on what the 100 days had meant. Was it a glorious last stand, a demonstration that his legend remained powerful? Or was it a mistake, an inability to accept that the story was finished, a grasping for past glory that only added a final chapter of defeat to a career that might have ended more ambiguously on Elba? The questions had no clear answers, or perhaps they had too many answers, depending on who was asked and when. But the result was clear. Napoleon was leaving Europe forever, sailing toward an exile from which there would be no escape, no dramatic return, no final act of the drama that had consumed his life and reshaped the continent. The dream was ending, not with the bang of battle or the glory of victory, but with the quiet finality of a ship disappearing over the horizon, carrying a prisoner to his last kingdom. The voyage to St. Helena took 10 weeks, HMS Northumberland sailing south across the equator into seas that few Europeans travelled, toward an island that existed in British possession but felt like the edge of the world. Napoleon, confined to the ship but treated with a courtesy that acknowledged his former rank, if not his current status, spent the days reading, writing, conversing with those companions who had chosen to accompany him into exile. St. Helena appeared on the horizon on October 15th, 1815, a volcanic rock rising from the South Atlantic, cliffs and barren slopes offering little welcome. The island was small, about 50 square miles, isolated by 1,000 miles of ocean from the nearest land, a natural prison more secure than any fortress. Here Napoleon would spend his remaining years, watched by British troops and officials, cut off from Europe and the events that continued to unfold there. He was initially housed at the Briars, a cottage on the property of the East India Company's agent, before Longwood House, designated as his residence, could be prepared. Longwood sat on a plateau, exposed to the wind, damp and uncomfortable, a residence chosen more for its ability to be guarded than for any consideration of the prisoner's comfort. Napoleon established a routine in exile, rising late, spending mornings in dictation and conversation, afternoons in reading, or walks when the weather permitted, evenings in card games or discussion with his small court. Those who had accompanied him, Generals Bertrand and Montholon, the Count de las Cases, who served as secretary, and a handful of servants, formed his household, the remnant of an imperial court now reduced to the confines of Longwood House. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, arrived in April 1816, and his relationship with Napoleon was contentious from the start. Lowe saw his role as jailer, responsible for ensuring the prisoner remained secure, and he enforced petty restrictions that Napoleon saw as deliberate humiliations. Napoleon refused to see Lowe after their early meetings, conducting all necessary business through intermediaries, maintaining a cold war of dignity and authority within the confines of the island. Napoleon spent much of his time dictating his memoirs, shaping the narrative of his life and career for posterity. He emphasized his role as heir to the revolution, defender of France against reactionary coalitions, victim of British perfidy and European jealousy. The defeats were minimized or explained away, the victories magnified, the intentions always noble, even when the results were disastrous. He was writing himself into history, creating the legend that would outlast the reality. The climate of St. Helena was harsh for Napoleon, the dampness aggravated his health, and he began to suffer from various ailments, stomach pains, and general debility that worsened over time. Whether these symptoms indicated a serious illness or were psychosomatic, the products of enforced idleness and mental anguish, was debated by his doctors and would be debated by historians after his death. Visitors occasionally reached the island, travelers who had obtained permission to visit, and Napoleon received some of them, engaging in conversation, presenting himself as the victim of unjust imprisonment. The great man brought low by lesser enemies. These visits and the accounts the visitors published kept Napoleon's name in European consciousness, maintaining the legend even as the man himself deteriorated in his Atlantic exile. The years passed slowly on St. Helena, each day much like the one before, the seasons marked only by changes in weather and the arrival or departure of ships that brought supplies and news. Napoleon received word of events in Europe, the reactionary policies of the restored monarchies, the occasional liberal uprising, the slow working out of the post-Napoleonic order. His son, the King of Rome, was in Vienna, raised as an Austrian prince, cut off from his father and his French heritage. Josephine had died in 1814, and Marie-Louise had found a new life in Italy, the Imperial family scattered and diminished. In 1820, Napoleon's health took a serious turn for the worse. The stomach pains intensified, he lost weight, and even his formidable will could not shake off the weakness that was spreading through his body. The British doctors diagnosed various ailments, but they could not halt the decline, and Napoleon himself spoke of approaching death with a resignation that was uncharacteristic for a man who had spent his life in constant action. He made his will, distributing what possessions he had, leaving instructions for his burial, composing a final message to his son. In these last acts he remained the emperor, dignified and conscious of posterity, shaping even his death to serve the legend he had been constructing throughout his exile. On May 5, 1821, at about 5:49 in the evening, Napoleon died at Longwood House, attended by a few companions and the British officials who had been his jailers. He was 51 years old, his body worn out by illness and perhaps by the accumulated strain of a life lived at an intensity that few men could sustain. The cause of death was recorded as stomach cancer, though later theories would suggest arsenic poisoning, deliberate or environmental, adding one final mystery to a life already thick with legend. His body was autopsied, then buried on St. Helena in a grave in the Valley of the Geraniums, a spot he had selected on one of his walks, where willows grew and a spring provided water, a place of some peace in the bleak landscape of the island. The British had refused his request to be buried in France, and so he was laid to rest in the soil of his final prison, far from the battlefields and palaces where he had made history. But death didn't end Napoleon's influence on history. The legend he had crafted in exile took root in European consciousness, particularly in France, where each successive regime had to define itself in relation to the Napoleonic legacy. His legal codes remained in force, his administrative reforms shaped modern governance, and the map of Europe, though redrawn after his fall, bore the marks of his ambitions. In 1840, nearly 20 years after his death, Louis-Philippe, the July monarchy king of France, arranged for Napoleon's body to be returned to Paris. The ship carrying his remains up the Seine was met by enormous crowds, and he was interred with great ceremony at Les Invalides, finally brought home to France as he had wished. The once controversial figure had become a symbol of French glory, the Revolution's heir, the emperor who had made France the master of Europe, however briefly. The island of St. Helena returned to obscurity after Napoleon's death, its moment of historical significance passed, leaving only the memory of the prisoner who had paced its paths and gazed across its seas toward a Europe he would never see again. The wind continued to blow across Longwood's plateau. The waves crashed against the volcanic cliffs, and the island resumed its ancient rhythm, indifferent to the human drama that had briefly made it the stage for the final act of one of history's great lives. Napoleon's story, from Corsica to St. Helena, from obscure lieutenant to emperor of the French, had finally reached its end. The dream of empire had faded, but the legend would persist, argued over by historians, celebrated in art and literature, invoked by politicians and military leaders for generations to come. He had reshaped Europe through war and reform, had risen higher than perhaps any commoner in history, and had fallen further than most monarchs could imagine. But in the final analysis, measured against the quiet permanence of history, what did it all mean? The empires rise and fall, the boundaries change and change again, the glory fades and is replaced by other glories. Napoleon had been a force of nature, a historical phenomenon, but time passes, and even the greatest achievements become distant, softened by years into stories, legends, the material of memory rather than present reality. On St. Helena, in the last years, Napoleon had sometimes spoken of his legacy, of how history would judge him. He believed it would be favorable, that his achievements would outweigh his failures, that he would be remembered as a great man, perhaps the greatest of his age. Whether he was right or wrong, whether his assessment was accurate or the product of self-delusion, is a question each age answers differently, each observer from their own perspective. But perhaps the truest legacy is not in the judgments of historians or the monuments of nations, but in the simple fact that the story still compels us, that we still wonder about the man from Corsica who almost conquered Europe, who crowned himself emperor and reshaped the world according to his vision before falling to exile and death on a remote island. The dream may have failed, but the dreaming itself was extraordinary, and in the end, perhaps that is enough, to have dreamed greatly, to have attempted the impossible, and to have left a mark on history that time has not yet erased. The sun sets over St. Helena as it has for millions of years, painting the Atlantic in colors of gold and red before darkness falls. The island sleeps, and in Paris, at Les Invalides, the tomb of Napoleon stands in the quiet, visited by thousands each year, a place of pilgrimage and reflection. The emperor rests now, his wars finished, his ambitions stilled, but the story continues, told and retold, a tale of ambition and achievement, of glory and disaster, of a life lived at the extremes of human possibility. And so we leave Napoleon in his tomb, in his legend, in the pages of history that will be written and rewritten as long as humans care about the past. The dream ended on St. Helena, but dreams, once dreamed, never fully disappear. They echo forward through time, influencing new dreamers, inspiring new ambitions, reminding us that the impossible is sometimes merely the not yet achieved, and that one person, armed with will and genius and opportunity, can indeed change the world, for better or worse, for glory or disaster, leaving a mark that endures long after the dreamer has turned to dust. Sleep now, listener, and dream your own dreams, shaped perhaps by the story you have heard tonight, of Napoleon, the emperor from Corsica, the revolutionary general, the man who reached for everything and, for a moment, almost held it in his grasp. The end